I hope that you're having a good week. Is this the midway point?
Yes, halfway.
So the end's in sight. Hopefully enthusiasm is still boiling forward, and we'll keep things going today with a short talk about democracy, what it means, and what people back then thought of democracy. Right? Because we today often think, of course people love democracy, right? But what if people didn't? Even the early founders of our country didn't necessarily love the idea of democracy. Because they didn't. Then we have to start to ask, how is it that they came to like the idea of democracy? All right, so that's what I want to talk about today. And what did they think was necessary to preserve democracy once they came to think of it as a good thing? Okay? There are four major points that I just want to highlight at the beginning. All right? One, freedom and democracy aren't necessarily the same things. Right? Just because you have the freedom to go about doing the things that you want to do doesn't necessarily mean that you're guaranteed the right to participate in government, right? Though democracy generally means and generally helps to ensure that your freedoms will be protected. All right, so that's point one. Point two, and I've already mentioned this, the men who created the United States were not Democrats. And I mean this in a small, when I say Democrat and Republican, it has nothing to do with the parties that exist today. All right? But they weren't Democrats. I'll explain more on that in a moment. Thirdly, the size of the United States. Think how big this country was, even back then. And the diversity within it meant that many people in the early United States couldn't easily agree on what the right policies were. Right? What good government meant. And often those who were out of power insisted that the policies of those who were in power were bad ones. And as a result, they appealed to what? They appealed to the idea of the people. And this is partly why democracy, as I'll talk about and explain in a moment, came to have a better meaning than it initially did. And finally, I just want to make this point. It's ironic, but in America, up to the Civil War, some of those who claimed to be the most democratic were themselves slaveholders. Interesting. But this is largely what happened, especially in the cases of Thomas Jefferson and Andrew Jackson, two of the more famous presidents whom you probably know a little something about. Now, let me start the story then in the colonial period, before the American Revolution, to show you how democracy was first understood by those in the United States. Unlike today, when democracy has all the positive connotations that we had, in the 18th century, in the 1700s, democracy connoted anarchy. It connoted violence. It meant to those who heard the term, things might be spiraling well out of control. And there was an example of something that they could turn to in English history. And we have to remember that the colonists thought of themselves first and foremost as Englishmen, not as Americans. There was something in English history they could turn and look back on and say, that's what democratic tendencies had led to. Anybody guess what that event was?
Glorious Revolution.
Even before that, the Glorious Revolution actually had some positive connotations.
Oh, yeah.
But what did the Glorious Revolution do?
Got rid of the king.
Did it get rid of the king?
Well, it replaced
It replaced the king with another king.
the king that was serving instead of
with exactly a more popular king, right? But a king nonetheless. If we rewind 50 years before the Glorious Revolution, we have an English Civil War. Anybody know what happened in that war? In the midst of that one? The king lost his head. And a Republican or more democratic form of government took place. And they experimented with it for about a decade or so. And then the English said, forget it. This isn't the type of government that we want. Chaos seems to be instilling. All these different religious groups are popping up. All of these, this concern of sort of that society is going to sort of just spiral out of control led them to return to a system of monarchy. This was the legacy that people in the 18th century had whenever they talked about democracy. Democracy meant violence. Democracy meant possible chaos. And indeed, the colonial period remained largely a hierarchical society, one that was elite-driven, one in which Americans celebrated the king. When the king had a son, parades were had on the streets of Philadelphia and Boston, celebrating the birth of the heir to the throne. We have to get over the idea, right, that American democracy was naturally going to develop. Because in the mid-18th century, Americans were not thinking like Democrats. Now, this didn't mean that colonists didn't have an understanding, or Englishmen didn't have an understanding of the idea of rights. Right? People had certain rights, and they had those rights, colonists thought, because they were Englishmen. And what were those rights? Those rights included things like a trial by jury. They included the right not to have an army that would keep you from doing what you wanted to do. And for many, it included the right to no taxation without representation. In the 18th century context, though, these rights didn't come necessarily from nature. They certainly didn't come because you were born in America. They came because you were born as an Englishman. And they generally only refer to English men. Women's rights being completely consumed by husbands or fathers. Fears of democracy then continued. Even after the American revolutionaries began to feel as if their rights were being betrayed by the King and Parliament of England.